Before the story begins, take 1 second to subscribe, because stories like this remind us how powerful silence can be and how one word can undo 30 years of it. My name is Dulce Witford. I'm 39 years old. I'm a hospice nurse. And this is the story of the autumn my father pointed at a gravel road, and a woman in a silver sedan made sure it was the last order he ever gave me. It was late October, the kind of gray that sits on your shoulders like a wet coat. 60 of my relatives were gathered under the old walnut trees behind my father's house, plates balanced on their knees, steam rising off casseroles into the cold air. And my father, Harlan Whitfield, stood at the head of it all and lifted one finger toward the road. He didn't raise his voice. Harlan never raised his voice. He simply pointed, the way you'd point at a stray dog that wandered too close to the porch. Nobody said my name. My Uncle Frank kept buttering his roll. My sister Colette studied the tablecloth like it held the answer to something. And I stood there in the cold, waiting for even one person to look up. Nobody did. So I turned, and I walked back down the lane toward my car, gravel crunching under my boots, 30 pairs of eyes, very carefully not watching me leave. But here's what none of them knew that afternoon. A silver sedan was already turning off the county highway, moving slow, patient, like it had nowhere else it needed to be. And the woman inside it had been waiting 7 years for my father to do exactly what he had just done. I'm Della. And this is the story of how one quiet word, spoken at a farm gate, ended my father's kingdom. The car eased to a stop beside me on the shoulder, close enough that I could see my breath fog against its clean window. The driver stepped out first and opened the back door like we were standing outside a hotel lobby, not a dirt lane in the middle of nowhere. Then she stepped out. Marguerite Sinclair, my godmother, my late mother's closest friend since their college days, the woman who'd built a small chain of pharmacies out of one counter in a strip mall. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, for years earlier. She didn't hug me. She took my wrist and squeezed it once, the way people do when words would cost too much, just then. Then she looked past me, past the walnut trees, past the sagging porch, past my father, who stood frozen with his finger still raised in the air like he'd forgotten to lower it. She let the silence stretch. And then, in a voice that didn't need to shout to carry across an entire field, she said one word. Disinherited. That was all. My father's face drained the color of the sky above us. 60 relatives stopped chewing at the exact same second. I swear even the wind held still. Marguerite turned back to me as if the rest of them had simply stopped existing. Not here, she said softly. Tomorrow. The diner on Route 9. 7 o'clock. Bring your appetite, sweetheart. You've been hungry a long time. She got back into the car. Gravel popped softly beneath the tires as it pulled away. Behind me, I could already hear my father's voice rising for the first time in years. I didn't turn around. That single word had taken 7 years to build. And to understand it, I need to take you back to where it started. In my mother's kitchen. Rewind 1 week. I was 2 hours south, in my small rented apartment, eating dinner standing over the sink after a 12-hour shift, when my cousin Priya's texts started coming in, 3 of them, spaced out like gunfire. Grandma fell again. 2nd time this month. Nobody will call a doctor. You're the only nurse this family ever produced.
Della, please.
I stood there with a fork in my hand, reading those words until the screen went dark on its own. My grandmother, Eleanor Voss, was 89 years old and lived in the small blue farmhouse 200 yards behind my father's house. She was my mother's mother, and she was also the one person on that entire property I trusted least to tell me the whole truth, mostly because she hadn't answered a single one of my letters in 7 years. So no, I didn't wake up one gray morning and decide to crash a family reunion out of loneliness. I was summoned, and I chose that day on purpose, because it was the one day a year Eleanor was guaranteed to be wheeled out into the open where I could actually lay eyes on her, without ever having to set foot inside anyone's kitchen. I told Priya I'd come, that I'd stand at the edge of the yard, look at Grandma, and leave. That was the entire plan. What I hadn't accounted for was my father moving her chair, at the very last minute, to sit directly beside his own. A seating chart sounds like a small thing to blow up a family over. So let me show you the family first. The Whitfields had run a 280-acre apple orchard in that county for 3 generations. My father ran it the way his father had run it before him: low voice, straight spine, and one rule repeated so often it might as well have been carved into the porch beam. A family holds together because one hand holds it. His hand. Always his. He decided who sat where, whose name got spoken at Thanksgiving, and whose got quietly retired. He forgave debts out loud at the table so the whole family could hear exactly what forgiveness cost. My mother, Colleen, moved through that house like water finding the cracks in stone. She kept a rose garden by the kitchen door that he once called a waste of good dirt. Every June it bloomed anyway, so hard you could smell it from the road. She never argued with him in front of us. I used to think that made her weak. I was wrong about that in a way that took me half my life to understand. The first real crack came the autumn I was 18, out in the roses during harvest, when I heard my mother cough twice into her sleeve and glance around to see who'd noticed. That cough turned out to be nothing that year. But I date everything from that harvest anyway because it was the same fall I told my father I was leaving for nursing school. And I watched him take out the invisible ledger he kept on all of us and write my name on the debit side.
He didn't yell.
He never yelled. He simply said, "Girls who leave the land always come back needing it." Then he stopped paying my phone bill as a lesson in economics. I went anyway. I cleaned motel rooms. I took the night shifts nobody wanted. I finished nursing school owing nobody anything, which, in my father's arithmetic, was the worst possible outcome. A debt he couldn't hold was a daughter he could no longer steer. My brother Nathaniel stayed. 3 years older than me, built for the work. He did everything the way the code demanded. Married the neighbor's daughter, moved into the east wing of the main house, learned the spray schedules and the loan officer's first name. At Thanksgiving, my father would carve the turkey and hand Nathaniel the first plate, like a knighthood. I got mine 4th or 5th, usually after a joke about city wages. And still I came home. Every holiday. Every harvest weekend. I drove north with pie and clean scrubs in my trunk, and I checked my grandmother's blood pressure, and I bandaged cut hands, and I paid dues into a family that never once marked the debt paid. My mother would walk me to my car, every time. She'd press a rose cutting into my palm and say, "Plan it where you are." It took me 20 years to hear that sentence correctly. The real cough came 9 years later.
March.
I was 29. Ovarian cancer, stage 3. I was standing in a hospital hallway on shift when she called me, and she apologized. Apologized for interrupting my workday. Within a week, I'd rearranged my entire caseload to drive north every weekend. Within 2, I understood exactly how my father intended to fight her illness, the same way he ran the orchard. He put the appointment calendar on his desk, drove her to every visit, sat in on every consultation. And when the oncologist recommended a second opinion at the university hospital, my father thanked the doctor, walked my mother to the truck, and told her on the drive home that they weren't going to go shopping around for a diagnosis like it was a second-hand tractor. I found out the way I found out everything in that house from Eleanor over the sound of running water at the sink. So I acted. I want that on the record because the family's version of the story likes to pretend I appeared out of nowhere with a savior complex. I called the university myself, got her an appointment in 11 days, told my mother in person, offered to drive her. She looked toward the kitchen doorway for a long moment. Then she said yes. 2 days before that appointment, it disappeared.
Canceled by phone.
They told me, when I called, that her husband had explained she was already under excellent care closer to home. When I confronted my father, he took off his glasses, looked at me with something close to pity, and said the sentence that still finds me at 3 in the morning. "You've been gone too long, Della. You've forgotten how this family gets through things." For 2 years, my mother got through things. That's the polite phrase for it. The treatments bought time, and then they stopped. By the spring she turned 58, we'd moved from fighting the cancer to negotiating with it. I know that sound. I've sat with dozens of families as it arrives. Good dying looks like pain that's controlled. Questions that get answered. A person who is still steering for as long as steering is theirs to do. My mother had none of that. She had a husband who rationed her pain medication against a calendar because he'd read somewhere that people get dependent. A bedroom upstairs she could no longer climb to without stopping twice. A cot in the parlor so she wouldn't, in his words, wear herself out being dramatic. The word hospice entered that house exactly once, from her doctor's mouth. My father closed it out like a storm shutter. "We keep our own," he said. I would drive down Sunday nights with my hands shaking on the wheel, cataloging everything wrong the way only a nurse can: the untouched pain log, the pressure sore risk, the weight falling off her frame. Every Monday I'd call and get managed. "She's comfortable. She ate well. Don't stir her up." Her voice got smaller every week. And one Sunday in October, holding my hand at that small parlor table, she made the only direct request of her entire life to me. "I don't want to do the last part his way." So I stopped asking my father's permission. People imagine defying a man like Harlan looks like a shouting match. It looks like paperwork. I called her doctor, told him plainly what her days actually looked like. He told me what I already knew, that hospice was overdue and the only signature required was hers, not her husband's. That distinction is the hinge my entire life turned on. I brought the intake nurse on a Tuesday morning while my father was at the co-op, and my mother signed her own name at her own kitchen table. When he came home, there was a hospital bed in the parlor, a morphine schedule taped inside a cabinet door, and a stranger in scrubs quietly asking him to keep his voice down in his own house. He never forgave any of us for it. But those final 6 weeks bought something I will defend until my last breath. My mother slept without gritting her teeth. She had lucid mornings, her hands warm around a coffee cup. Marguerite drove out twice a week, and the two of them talked behind a closed parlor door for hours. Once, passing that doorway, I saw papers spread across her blanket, Marguerite's reading glasses on, my mother signing something slow and careful with a good pen from the desk. I thought it was funeral planning. I let it be. She died on a Thursday morning just before dawn, my hand in hers, my grandmother asleep in the chair beside us. My father was asleep upstairs. He declared the overnight parlor shift unnecessary. At the graveside, 10 feet from the casket, Marguerite stood apart from the rest of the family, holding a leather folder against her coat like a shield. I was too hollow that day to wonder why. The lunch after the funeral was back at the main house. I was in the kitchen, washing cups, when the room behind me went quiet, and I turned around with wet hands to find my father standing in the doorway, the whole family arranged behind him like a jury that had already reached its verdict.
He had a speech ready. He always did.
But this one was short. He said I'd gone behind his back, in his own house, that I'd filled his wife's final weeks with strangers and drugs, that I'd turned her dying into my little project, and that a daughter capable of that had already left the family. She just hadn't had the decency to say so out loud. Then, flat, like reading a number off a balance sheet, "You're dead to this family." I stood there with a dish towel in my hands and looked past him, one face at a time. My aunts studied the floor. Nathaniel studied the window. Eleanor was in the parlor with the door shut, sedated with grief, and never heard a word of it. Remember that detail. 7 years later, it turns out to matter more than anything else in the story. Nobody walked me to my car. I folded the dish towel because my mother raised me to leave a kitchen properly, and I drove 2 hours south with the radio off. Somewhere on that highway, I understood I wasn't going to fight it. You cannot argue your way back onto a list one man keeps in pencil. My mother, it turned out, had already known this exact scene was coming, and she had already answered it. I just wouldn't learn how for 7 more years. Here is what dead to the family looked like from the inside. It looked like building a life out of nothing but work. I took on more home care patients than any nurse at my agency. The long, difficult cases, the widowers with no one left, the women whose children lived 3 states away and called only on birthdays. I got a reputation. Call Della. She doesn't quit on the hard ones. My supervisor once told me I overfunctioned, like it was a compliment. I took it as one, which tells you exactly how far from that farm I still hadn't managed to travel. Every October, on my mother's birthday week, I wrote my grandmother a letter. Real paper. Real stamp. The maples turned early this year. I planted your daughter's roses by my porch steps, and they took. I'm fine, Grandma. I'm fine. I'm fine. 7 Octobers. 7 letters. Not one answer ever came back. I told myself she was simply old, that my father had fed her some tidy version of events, that it was mercy to stop expecting a reply. But I never once stopped writing them. And it took me the length of this entire story to understand why.
Some part of me was still paying rent.
Still keeping a claim current on a family that had already condemned the property. The 7th letter was already written, sealed, and stamped. Writing in my glove compartment the morning Priya's texts came in like flares over a trillion. So when I tell you I drove north planning to stand for 20 minutes at the edge of my old life, understand that the letter came with me too, just in case there was a mailbox somewhere that would still take it. That cold gray Saturday. 2 hours north, coffee going lukewarm in the cup holder. 20 minutes at the edge of the yard. 2 hours home. I'd told Priya to expect me at the far corner, past the tables, where a person can stand without technically being a guest. I parked on the shoulder like a delivery driver double-checking an address, and the moment I stepped out I saw Eleanor, and my stomach dropped because she wasn't tucked at the quiet end of the gathering the way Priya had promised. She was at the head table, at my father's right hand, a shawl arranged over her shoulders like a centerpiece. He'd moved her chair that very morning. No explanation given, which meant there was no path to my grandmother that didn't run directly past him. I want you to notice what I actually did because my family's version of the story says I marched in demanding a scene. I stood at the edge of that yard for 10 full minutes, hands shoved in my coat pockets, waiting for him to get distracted by the cider press.
He looked up anyway.
Some men can feel an uninvited presence on their land the way other people feel a change in weather. He rose without hurrying, walked to the edge of the gathering, raised one finger toward the road while 60 relatives watched him over their paper plates. "You're standing somewhere you're not welcome," he said, not even raising his voice. "You know the way back." And they all went back to their meals. Every single one of them. You already know what rolled up that lane while I stood on the gravel, deciding whether a person could actually die twice. The diner on Route 9 opens at 6 for the dairy men, and by 7 sharp Marguerite was already in the corner booth, tea in front of her, looking like a bank that had learned how to sit down. I'd taken a room at a motel on the county line rather than drive 4 hours round trip for one conversation. She let me order eggs before she said a single thing that mattered. Then she folded her hands and looked at me the way she used to when I was a child, back when she'd blow into town with department store dresses in my size, and my father would announce their price out loud in front of everyone. "Your mother left me a to-do list," she said. 7 years long. Today was the last item on it. Asked what yesterday had been. Yesterday was item 6, announcing it. Today is explaining it, to the only person she wanted to understand it. On the table between us sat a plain manila folder, closed, squared exactly to the edge like it had been placed there with a level. I want to be honest. Marguerite Sinclair doesn't drive 2 hours to serve drama with breakfast. She built a pharmacy chain out of a rented counter in a strip mall. She thinks in inventory and consequence. Whatever was in that folder had been sitting somewhere, undisturbed, for 7 years, like a seed under snow. "Before I open this," she said, "I need you to hear one thing, honey, and hear it all the way down. None of what happens next is charity. It's your mother finishing a sentence. Here is what was inside." In the order she laid it across that diner table, between the ketchup bottle and my untouched eggs. A deed history, a trust instrument thick as a hymnal, and 1 page of numbered instructions, written in my mother's looping hand. The 280 acres, the orchard, the cropland, the packing barn, the main house with its proud white porch, the small blue farmhouse where Eleanor lived. None of it, not 1 single acre, had ever belonged to my father. The land had come down through my mother's family, inherited by Colleen from her own father, before I was even born. In 40 years of marriage, she had never once put my father's name on the deed. He had farmed it. He had ruled it. He had pointed at its road like a king surveying his kingdom. On paper, he had always been a tenant. 8 months before she died, in those quiet parlor afternoons behind the closed door, with a good pen out, my mother had moved every acre into something called the Voss Family Trust, an irrevocable trust, with exactly one trustee. The woman sitting across from me, stirring her tea. I sat back in that booth. Outside the window, a grain truck rolled past, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that the driver had no idea the entire county had just changed shape. The gate my father had pointed from was never his gate. The road he'd sent me down was the only thing in view he actually held any share of, and only because his tax dollars had helped pave it. He knows, Marguerite said, watching me do the arithmetic in real time. He's known since the month she died. That's a different story. And it's tomorrow's story. Then she touched the corner of a sealed cream envelope tucked inside the folder, my name on it, in my mother's own hand, and gently slid it out of my reach. Not yet. She gave me an order of operations that day, and I never once broke it. I'll spare you the full hour of how, and give you the load-bearing answers. How does a man not know his own farm was never his? He knew. Formal notice had gone out within weeks of my mother's death. Certified mail, trustee letterhead, the entire architecture of her decision laid out in black and white. He'd had a window to challenge it in court. He'd quietly consulted a lawyer in town, and the lawyer had told him, for free, what Marguerite's attorney could have told him for a fee. Colleen had built it clean. Her land, inherited solely in her name, moved into trust while she was of entirely sound mind, with a doctor's note and 2 witnesses to prove it. Contest that, the lawyer said, and you'll spend a fortune losing in public. So my father did the one thing his code allowed. He said nothing to anyone, and carried on as king of dirt he merely rented. Why would a hard man stay so calm about that? Because the rent itself was mercy. The trust leased the entire operation back to Whitfield Orchards at terms Marguerite described, dry as a pharmacist reading a label, as roughly the cost of a decent used pickup truck annually. The family meeting where he'd have had to explain to Nathaniel, to everyone, exactly why the Voss name sat on their deed. That meeting never had to happen. As long as he behaved. Behaved how? I asked. Marguerite looked at me over her glasses. Your mother wrote the condition herself. You'll read it in her own hand, when it's time. She closed the folder, squared it again to the table's edge. Go see Eleanor, Della. Today's item has 3 parts, and your grandmother is all 3 of them. Getting to my grandmother without setting the whole farm on fire took planning worthy of a prison break, which tells you everything about how that family understood love. Priya ran the logistics by text from her own kitchen. Monday mornings, my father drove to the co-op meeting at 9 and stayed through lunch, a window of 2 hours, maybe 3. Nathaniel would be out in the far rows with the picking crew. His wife did her grocery run on Mondays. Priya would park by the equipment shed, where a car raised no questions, and walk me back to the blue farmhouse herself. She hugged me in that shed lot like something finally breaking open. 7 years since anyone in that family had touched me on purpose. Then she held me at arm's length. Before you go in, it's not good in there, Della. I've been saying it's not good for a year, and everybody looks at me like I've insulted the weather. One more thing, she said, as we walked the back path behind the windbreak, out of sight of the main house. The reunion I'd been thrown out of was supposed to end with an announcement. My father had asked the aunts to stay for coffee because he had news about the future of the farm. Those exact words. Then a silver sedan had blown the whole agenda into the pond, and whatever the news was had stayed folded in his pocket. I filed that away, the way a nurse files strange vitals for later. Then we came around the lilac hedge, and I got my first look at that farmhouse in 7 years, and I stopped walking. Paint peeling off the porch posts in long strips. A gutter hanging by one strap. Grass grown to my shins where Eleanor's tomato beds used to stand in neat, surveyed rows. And through the screen door, a smell I recognized instantly from work, the particular smell of a house where nobody's been cleaning because nobody's been coming. My grandmother sat in her winged chair in the front room, and my first look at her hit 2 people inside me at once, the granddaughter and the nurse. Both of them wanted to sit down on the floor. Eleanor Voss had always been a small, quick woman, the kind who beat you to the kettle before you'd finish sitting. The woman in that chair had hollows under her cheekbones I could have measured with 2 fingers. Her cardigan hung off her like it belonged to someone larger. A bruise, going yellow-green, ran up her left forearm in the exact shape of a stair rail. On the table beside her stood the saddest little pharmacy I'd seen in years. Pill bottles clustered like bowling pins, no organizer, no list, 2 of them from pharmacies in different towns. She studied my face for a long moment, running through it the patient way the very old do, like flipping through a card catalog. Then she found me. "Colleen's girl," she said, and her chin began to tremble.
Della.
I knelt by the chair and took her hands. Bird bones wrapped in paper. She gripped me harder than she should have been able to. Then she said the thing that rearranged my entire understanding of the last 7 years. Not an apology. An accusation, soft as worn flannel. "They told me you stopped writing, sweetheart. All those years. Why did you stop writing to me?" Behind me, Priya went very still in the doorway. I kept my voice level. "Grandma, I never stopped. Not one October." Eleanor looked at me, and then, slowly, terribly, at a small tin box on the mantel. A butter cookie tin, the blue kind every grandmother in that county seemed to own. She had Priya take it down and set it in my lap. "Open it." Inside, rubber-banded into bundles, were letters.
Dozens of them. Sealed.
Stamped. Addressed in my grandmother's careful, schoolhouse cursive, to me, my old address, then my new one, after Priya had slipped it to her 3 Christmases back. Every single one unmailed. "I wrote you every month at first," Eleanor said. "Then every season, when my hands got bad. I gave them to your father to mail, when he brought my groceries. He tucked them right here." She patted her own chest flat twice, and pat them like that. And I'd ask, "Any word from Della?" And he'd get that sorrowful look and say, "No, mother. She's moved on. City people do." I sat there holding 7 years of intercepted love in both hands. He hadn't even thrown them away. That's the detail I couldn't get past then, and still can't get past now. He'd kept them coming, collected them like rent, and somewhere between his shirt pocket and the mailbox at the end of the lane, my grandmother and I had both been fed the exact same lie about each other. She doesn't answer. She doesn't write. She let you go. A wall built out of nothing but 2 people's silence, each one quietly grieving the other from inside a house 200 yards apart. Priya was crying in the doorway. Eleanor wasn't. She was watching me with her daughter's eyes, and what sat inside them wasn't grief. It was a question, the assessing kind. Then gravel popped in the drive out front. 1 vehicle, coming easy. Too early to be my father. It wasn't my father. Through the curtain, I watched Nathaniel's truck roll to a stop by the porch, back early from the far rows, a coil of irrigation line in the bed as his alibi. I had maybe 2 minutes. And I want you to see exactly how I spent them, because everything that happens later in courthouses, in county offices, stands on the scene. I spent them being a nurse. I photographed the bruise on Eleanor's arm. With her spoken permission, she offered her sleeve up the way you would for a blood drive. I photographed all 9 pill bottles. I photographed a dressing on her shin someone had improvised out of paper towel and packing tape, over a wound that had clearly been leaking long enough to draw its own map. And I read the labels. My training put a cold hand flat against my back. Warfarin. My grandmother was on a blood thinner for her heart, the kind of drug you never run loose. The kind that needs blood tests on a schedule, a dosing calendar, 1 pharmacy, 1 list. The date of her last blood test, on the paperwork tucked in the drawer, was 14 months old. Doubled bottles from 2 different towns. A fall risk on a medication where a fall can mean bleeding you can't even see happening. In my line of work, we have a phrase for exactly what I was looking at. It isn't neglect at first glance. It's self-neglect, enabled by isolation, until you remember that somebody had been controlling the pharmacy runs, the doctor visits, the mail, and the guest list the entire time. Boots hit the porch boards. I put my phone away and stood between my grandmother and the door, out of some habit I didn't know I still carried. Nathaniel filled the doorway the way our father used to. For 1 honest second, his face was simply glad to see me. Then he remembered whose son he was. He didn't throw me out. I want to be fair to my brother because this story isn't fair to him in other ways. He sent Priya to watch the lane, sat down heavily on Eleanor's ottoman, and rubbed his face with both hands like a man wiping off a day that was only half finished. You shouldn't be here, Della. I told him our grandmother needed a doctor, a blood test, a proper medication list, and that he already knew it. I know she's old, he said. Old isn't a crime scene. I asked him when Eleanor had last been to church. To the diner. Anywhere. He didn't answer that. He looked at the tin box still sitting open on the chair, at all those stamped envelopes, and something crossed his face. I chose to read his shame. And then he covered it, the way our family covered everything. With management.
Look.
Saturday rattled him. That woman rolling up in that car, saying that word in front of everybody. He's been on the phone with lawyers since Sunday. You being in this house today is gasoline. You understand me? Don't make him choose again. Then my brother said the quiet part. The part that told me he'd understood the stakes all along. Every year of it. Last time we lost you. This time it'll be Grandma. He'll close this house like a fist, and no county paper will ever open it.
And you know him.
So you know I'm right. He stood. Message delivered. At the door, his back still to me, he added, You don't know what's coming Saturday. There's another family meeting. Whatever your godmother thinks she's doing. Dad doesn't lose on his own land.
His own land.
Even then. Even knowing. I drove home that night with the tin box, riding on the passenger seat, because Eleanor had pressed it on me. They're yours. They were always yours. Somewhere past the county line, I pulled into a gas station and sat under the fluorescent canopy and made the call I'd been circling all afternoon. Not a report yet. The state runs a line where a person can lay out a situation without giving names and simply ask what it adds up to. I laid it out like a case. An elderly woman, alone in a failing house. Unmonitored blood thinner, duplicate bottles. An untreated wound. Recent falls. A family controlling the doctor, the pharmacy, the mail. The woman on the other end went quiet for a second, then asked if I was a mandated reporter, because if so, I should know that what I described wasn't a gray area, and if the warfarin truly was unmonitored, I shouldn't wait on family politics. I told her I'd be filing within the week. She gave me the county number. I sat there a long time afterward, watching moths bounce off the lights. I knew exactly how this would read at the main house. Not as a nurse doing what her license required. As the daughter they'd already buried, calling the government down on the family that buried her. I started the car. My hands were steady. That's the thing about finally having a job that's actually yours to do. Tuesday night, at my own kitchen table, I filed the report. Clean fields, drop-down menus, a checkbox swearing every word true. I attached the photographs, listed the medications from memory and from the pictures.
Dates.
The last blood test. The falls. The improvised dressing. I typed my name, my license number, my relationship to the adult in question, granddaughter. The cursor blinked on that word for a while. Then I hit submit and the screen handed me a case number, and I did the one thing I had spent my entire career doing for other people's emergencies and never once for my own. I started a folder. Plain manila, from the drawer. On the tab, in block letters, Eleanor. Inside went the photographs, the medication list, the confirmation page with the case number, and one of my grandmother's unmailed letters, the very first one she'd ever handed to that shirt pocket, still sealed. Some evidence you keep for a different court entirely. That folder meant there was no road back to quiet. For 7 years, my policy had been distance, don't call, don't push, pay the October letter, stay gone. That policy died on my kitchen table on a Tuesday night. The moment that case number existed, I was on the record against my father's house. Findable, subpoenable, undeniable. My phone rang while my hand was still resting on the folder. Marguerite. No greeting. A car door closing somewhere behind her voice. It's moving. Saturday. The main house. All of them. He's called a family meeting to get ahead of it.
Come.
Item 7 needs a witness. I met Marguerite Thursday at a coffee shop off the interstate, somewhere no one would ever mistake her for a Whitfield. She brought the numbers I'd asked for. If the farm was a patient, I wanted the full chart. She slid it across, and I read it the way I read lab results, top to bottom, twice. It was worse than I'd guessed. Whitfield Orchards owed the bank a little over $300,000 in operating debt, rolled over and restructured more times than anyone could count. 2 of the last 5 seasons had been hail years. There were liens on the big sprayer and the newer tractor. And the farm stand revenue, the cider money everyone assumed was pure profit, had been servicing interest payments since before the pandemic. "He's not a thief," Marguerite said, fair as a scale. "He's a decent farmer in a brutal decade who will not, on pain of death, let anyone see a number." Your mother understood that about him better than anyone. What the chart didn't explain was the part that kept me up all night. A farm that far in the red, paying any rent at all, should have bled out years ago. Something had been holding the wound shut. I asked her flat out how the operation was still breathing. My godmother, who answered everything, looked out at the highway for a long moment and answered like a woman stepping carefully around a stone she'd placed there herself. "Saturday," she said. "That answer belongs to Saturday. It isn't mine to give early. And honey, when you hear it, you're going to want to be sitting down anyway." She squared her cup on its saucer.
Now,
"Tell me about the farmhouse. Every detail. Because item 7 has a second half, and your grandmother is it." That second half arrived Friday, by way of a text thread from Priya that started with a photograph and got worse from there. She'd borrowed my father's truck to haul feed for her chickens. Normal, unremarkable, the way family trucks circulate. In the door pocket, folded around the vehicle registration, she found a glossy trifold brochure. Crestline Manor. Affordable residential care. A stock photo of a white-haired woman laughing at a card table. The cheap, county-contracted kind of place, the kind I knew from work and would never describe over dinner. Tucked inside it, a business card for a leasing outfit 2 counties over that arranged hunting leases on farmland. And a sticky note, in my father's own hand, a hand I would know anywhere, listing the blue farmhouse's square footage, with the words "winterize by December." It took Priya and me 1 phone call to assemble the whole machine. This was the announcement. This was the future of the farm he'd gathered the family to hear over coffee, before Marguerite's sedan detonated his agenda. Move Eleanor to Crestline for her own safety, he'd say. Watch him say it. Lease her emptied farmhouse to out-of-county hunters for cash. Then walk into the trust's 90-day review with a brand new argument. The old woman is now a cost center, and the estate should offset her care. My grandmother entered into the ledger as an underperforming asset. I stood in my kitchen and felt my own pulse, and I'll tell you honestly what I felt, because that's what this story is for. It wasn't sadness. It was the specific cold that comes over me at work, the moment a family stops being confused and starts being convenient. The cold that takes a few minutes and then starts writing things down. Priya texted 1 more line while I stood there. He pushed the meeting back a week. Rewrote the agenda. Grandma's care plan is item 1. Some fights you have with words at a table. Some you fight in advance, with paper, quietly, before the other side even knows the fight has already started. Monday morning, while my father sat at the co-op, Priya drove Eleanor to see her longtime doctor. I met them there on my day off in scrubs because scrubs change how a waiting room treats you. He hadn't laid eyes on her in 14 months. Every appointment, always canceled, always rescheduled by the household. He examined her for a full hour. Blood draw. The shin wound properly debrided and dressed. A medication reconciliation that made his jaw tighten, bottle by bottle. And then, because Eleanor asked for it herself, sitting straight-backed in her cardigan, sharp as a tax auditor, he documented what the law calls capacity. That she was oriented,
consistent,
fully competent to state her own wishes. She stated them for the record, hands folded neatly in her lap, and I will hear this sentence until the day I die. I was born on the Voss place, and I intend to leave it feet first for my own bed, with the window open. Write that down, young man. He wrote it down, and in the small conference room off the lobby, with a notary and 2 staff witnesses, every statutory box checked twice, my grandmother signed a healthcare power of attorney naming me, Della Whitfield, granddaughter, registered nurse, as her agent. should she ever be unable to speak for herself. It was entirely her idea. I want that carved somewhere permanent. On our way out, the front desk nurse walked us to the door and lowered her voice, the way people in that county do when a certain surname comes up. Be careful with that one, hun. That family doesn't lose on its own land. It unraveled by Wednesday through the dumbest possible thread, the pharmacy. Eleanor's doctor had properly consolidated all her prescriptions to the single pharmacy in the county seat. And the pharmacy, being thorough, called the number on file to confirm the change. The landline. The main house. My father listened, thanked the girl kindly, I'm told, and hung up. That evening, my phone lit up with the farm's number, a number I hadn't seen light up since it used to mean my mother. I stood in my kitchen and let it ring twice before answering, because a person is entitled to 2 rings to become a professional. 7 years of silence, and my father spent his entire first sentence on logistics. Whatever paper you had her sign, you'll be tearing it up. No hello. I said Eleanor had seen her own doctor of 20 years, at her own request. He talked straight over me. The flat ledger voice climbed into something I'd genuinely never heard from him before. Trespass on his property. Elder abuse, a stranger, he said, confusing a senile, old woman into signing her name away. He'd have the sheriff explain it to me himself. Maybe my employer would want to know what kind of nurse behaved this way. I stood very still and let it land, cataloging as I always do. He can evict her.
She's on trust land.
The power of attorney is notarized, witnessed, physician documented. The report is already filed. The county owns the next move now. Not him.
Paper. Paper.
Paper. My sandbags were already stacked. Then his voice dropped a full register, down to something almost gentle, which is exactly the register where my father keeps his weather. Saturday, he said. Come if you want. Watch me feed what's left of you to this family. The line clicked dead. I looked at the folder on my counter marked Eleanor, and I moved it further from the window, as if I thought the window might reach in and take it. Saturday came in gray again, as if October in that county only ever stalked one color. I drove north with the folder on the seat beside me and Marguerite's last instructions still in my ear from the night before. Say nothing until asked. Sit where you can see the door. And whatever he says, remember, everything in that room, except the people, already belongs to the trust. Certified letters had gone out Monday. Formal notice, attorney letterhead, the instrument finally executing in paper what her voice had only announced at the gate. Which meant my father had spent his own week the way I'd spent mine, reading documents that rearranged his entire world and deciding exactly who to feed to it. Cars lined the lane when I arrived. Not 60 relatives this time. The inner ring. The aunts and their husbands. Nathaniel and his wife. Priya, who caught my eye through the kitchen window and, by arrangement, didn't wave. I parked on the shoulder again, out of something between habit and superstition, and walked up the lane my father had once pointed me down. Nobody met me at the door. I let myself into the front hall, past the pegs where my mother's garden coat still hung, 7 years, and her coat still on its peg, which undid me more than any shouting ever could have. I stood in the doorway of the front room. They were all seated, papers squared in stacks on the long table. Marguerite sat to one side in her cream coat, hands folded, patient as an invoice. And my father stood at the head of the room, tall as ever. The last time I'd stood in this exact spot, he declared me dead in front of a jury just like this one. He looked up, saw me, and smiled like a man who'd spent the whole week sharpening something. He went first. Of course he went first. The man had never once entered a room in his life he didn't intend to chair. And I have to hand it to him, it was good. If I hadn't spent 7 years learning exactly what his voice does to a room, I might have believed it myself. He didn't rage.
He grieved.
He stood at the head of that table like a man carrying a casket alone, and told the family that after my mother's death, certain arrangements had been quietly made around the family land, by people outside the family, and that he'd carried the knowledge silently for 7 years to spare them the ugliness of it. But now, he said, the ugliness had driven up the lane in a silver car, and its timing was no accident. He looked directly at me for the first time. Ask yourselves, he said, sorrowful as a preacher, why the daughter who abandoned this family turns up the same week the lawyers do. Ask what she's already signed, and who she called on her own blood. Yes, he said it over one aunt's gasped the county. Caseworkers, government people, coming to paw through grandma's cabinets, asking who profits when a family gets pried open like that. Heads turned toward me on a single string. Nathaniel stared at the table so hard I thought the wood might confess something. It was masterful. And I said nothing, because Marguerite had told me not to, and because I was watching the one thing in that room my father couldn't manage, my godmother, unfolding her reading glasses without any hurry at all. The way a surgeon lays out a tray. Thank you, Harlan, she said, as though he'd simply introduced her at a luncheon. I'll take questions when I'm finished. And I'll be quick. None of this is complicated. It's only been kept from you. Then my godmother did the thing I will teach every woman I ever mentor for the rest of my life. She read the quiet facts, in a quiet voice, and let the facts alone do the yelling. The land under this table, she said, all 280 acres of it, has been Voss land since before any Whitfield ever sat down on it. It passed to Colleen from her father. It never passed to Harlan. 7 years ago, Colleen placed every acre into a trust and asked me to hold it. Since her death, this farm has operated on a lease. From that trust. She let the words sit there. Lease. I watched it travel the table like a dropped wire, and I watched it finally reach my brother. Nathaniel's head came up slowly off its hinge. He looked at our father, and there was something in his face I had never once seen there. An audit. We farm rented dirt, he said, quiet, but it cracked straight down the middle. 20 years I've put my back into this place and we're tenants. And you knew. His wife's hand closed on his sleeve. My father didn't look at his son at all. He kept his eyes fixed on Marguerite, with the flat calm of a man measuring a storm's distance by counting seconds, and said, family business gets handled by the head of the family. That's how it's always been done. Marguerite glanced up from her papers with mild, terrible courtesy.
Yes.
That is exactly what Colleen said you'd say. She wrote it down, word for word. I'll get there. For the first time in my entire life, I watched my father's hands search for something to hold on to. She read the terms into that silence the way sentences get read aloud in a courtroom. Evenly, without triumph, each clause its own small door closing. As of Monday's notice, Harlan Whitfield is removed as a permissible beneficiary of the Voss family trust, pursuant to powers Colleen wrote into the instrument herself. Removed, everywhere and forever, from distributions, from succession, from any interest in any acre. The word from the gate, now with its paperwork finally showing. 2. The lease to Whitfield Orchards will not renew on its current terms. She named the annual rent out loud, in dollars, and the room made a sound like a church pew creaking, because every person at that table carried debt of their own, and every one of them could do the division. Market rate, or vacate the barns within 90 days. 3. The blue farmhouse and its acre are withdrawn from the lease entirely, effective immediately. No one leases Eleanor Voss's home. No one wins it in a family meeting. It belongs to the trust. And the trust, she added, looking at no one in particular in a way that somehow looked at everyone, has been made aware of certain plans for its occupant.
The brochure.
The hunting lease card. The sticky note. She never named them. She didn't need to. I watched the back of my father's neck learn, in real time, that she already knew. I sat in my chair by the door. The dead daughter. The one who'd called the government on her own family, and felt the thing I would have sworn to you I hadn't come for. It tasted like every underdog movie you've ever cheered at. He'd built his throne on her dirt, and the Bill had just walked in wearing a cream coat. Hold on to that feeling. I want you to have it at full strength for exactly 1 more minute. Because then my uncle's husband asked the reasonable question, the same one I'd asked Marguerite myself, at a coffee shop off the interstate. If the rent had been kept low, fine. But low rent alone doesn't keep a farm carrying that much debt alive for 7 straight years. Something didn't add up. Marguerite took off her glasses, folded them, and set down the last stone. You're right. It doesn't add up. It was never meant to. It was meant to be carried. Keep the farm breathing. Keep his standing in this county intact. And never let him learn where the air was coming from. Unless, Marguerite let the word hang in the air. Unless what? My aunt whispered. Unless he used the family against one of his own children again. Publicly. The way he did at his wife's funeral lunch. Colleen wrote that condition herself. 2 Saturdays ago, at that gate, in front of 40 witnesses, he met it. She squared her papers. Your kingdom has run on a dead woman's kindness for 7 years, Harlan. It ran out this morning. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And then my father stood up, slowly, terribly calm, buttoned his jacket, and smiled at the whole room. I felt the entire afternoon tilt because that was not the face of a beaten man. That was the face of a man reaching for the one piece he had left on the board. Fine, my father said, pleasant as a foreclosure notice. The trust owns the dirt. The trust can own what's on it. He turned to the aunts, and his voice went sorrowful again, and I watched him do to Eleanor exactly what he'd done to me for 7 years. Process a person into a story. His mother-in-law was failing, he said.
Confused.
He'd been carrying her care alone for years, groceries, medicine, and now the county was involved. Caseworkers, opening her cabinets. And did they all understand who had called them? He pointed at me a second time. Worse than the gate ever was.
She filed a report on this family.
On her own blood. There are people from the government coming to Grandma Eleanor's house, because of her. The gasp went around the table like weather. So, it's finished. If the trust wants the farmhouse, the trust can have its bills too. From today, I am done gatekeeping. That's the word your caseworkers use, isn't it? No more groceries from my kitchen. No more rides. Whoever wants the old woman can have the old woman. He said it in front of his sisters-in-law, in front of his son, in front of God. And the room did not get up and walk out. That's the part one needs you to sit with about how systems like this hold themselves together. My aunt cried, and then she looked at me and said, why couldn't you have just left things be? 2 weeks earlier, they'd all watched a 67-year-old man point his finger at a gravel road. And now, apparently, I was the one who had done this. I had brought lawyers and counties and consequences into the family. The meeting broke apart around me like ice sliding off a roof. And my grandmother, 200 yards away in her chair, had just been publicly converted from mother into hostage. Nathaniel caught me on the porch. 41 years old, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, which I'd later learn was roughly true. He didn't yell either.
We don't yell.
It's the family disease. All that management. He stood there with his cap in both hands, working the brim between his fingers, and laid out his own arithmetic. Market rent on top of $300,000 in debt is a dead farm walking. 90 days lands squarely in the middle of storage season. The picking crews had families. His wife was already asking what county they'd even be living in by spring. He wasn't asking me to fix any of it. That's what took me apart. He was simply reporting it the way you'd report weather to whoever happened to be standing beside you. Then he said the thing he'd carried out onto that porch to say. I stayed Della. I did everything right. Married right. Worked right. Kept my mouth shut right. 20 years of doing everything right, and I found out today I'm a tenant on my own mother's dirt. Same as you found out you were mailing letters to a shirt pocket. He looked out at the orchard rows going dark. He could walk it blind. One of us left and one of us stayed. And it bought us exactly the same thing. Nothing. I could have said something clean about ledgers. About how a book only ever balances for the man holding the pencil. I didn't. I told him I was sorry, and I meant it for him, for his wife, for the crews. My brother nodded once, put his cap back on, and walked into a house that was never going to be his either. Watch that man. This story owes him a debt. And I pay my debts. Mine and my mother's both. The next front opened Tuesday by certified mail. Addressed to me. The state nursing board had received a complaint regarding my conduct and was opening a formal review. I stood in my kitchen, coat still on, reading the categories. Practicing outside scope. Exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Undue influence over an elderly person for financial gain. That last one had teeth, A granddaughter with a freshly signed power of attorney photographs beautifully in exactly the wrong light, if you tilt it just so. Anyone can file a board complaint. It costs nothing. It requires no proof to open. And while it's open, it sits on a license like a lien. By Thursday, my agency had fielded 2 anonymous calls asking whether they knew their nurse was under investigation. My supervisor, a good woman caught in an impossible spot, took me off my 2 newest cases pending clarity. There went a third of my hours. Let me say this part slowly, for anyone still in the back who thinks this story is only about acreage.
He couldn't touch the land.
So he reached for the license. The thing I'd built with night shifts and motel room summers. The only inheritance I'd ever actually banked on. My own 2 trained hands. If your family has ever aimed at your livelihood instead of your feelings, you already know the exact temperature of that particular cold. I laid the board letter in the folder marked Eleanor that night, right beside everything else, because a nurse files what hurts her. Then I sat at my table, and I did not call Marguerite, and I did not cry, and I did not blink for a while. Then the phone rang anyway. My office. Friday, Marguerite said. It's time. Item 8 is a letter. And it's addressed to you. Marguerite's office in the city sits 11 floors up, all glass and quiet. On Friday, she sat me down at the conference table, set the cream envelope in front of me, my name, in my mother's hand, and left the room, closing her own office door behind her.
I'll share what I can bear to.
It was dated 3 weeks before she died. The handwriting sloped downhill, tired, but unmistakably hers. It opened. If Rosie has kept the sequence, you're reading this after your father sent you away in front of the whole family, at the gate, knowing exactly where the audience would be best. My hands did something then I won't perform for a camera. She wrote that she had watched the disease of that house for her entire marriage and understood it far too late to save me from it. Love, kept in a ledger, entered and debated until every single person in the family had become a balance owed. She wrote that she had lacked the courage to break that ledger while she was alive. Her own words. I will argue with them forever. So she had done the one thing a quiet woman with her name on the deed could still do. She built a door he could never wall over and put the key into the hands of the only friend he'd never once managed to outlive. Then the lines I have read so many times the folds have gone soft. They will tell you that leaving was your sin, Della. Leaving was the first wise thing this family did in 3 generations. Your hands are a gift, sweetheart. They were never the rent. At the bottom, a postscript small, almost shy. There is one more envelope. It's his. Rosie will know the day. I sat alone in that glass room a long time, both hands flat on the table, the way I study patience. Studying nothing at all. Marguerite came back and carrying another folder, and behind her glasses, she had the eyes of a woman about to finish a friend's final chore. Now, she said, let's talk about what's yours. What was mine turned out to be a decision, wrapped in 2 stacks of paper. My mother had left the remainder of the trust to be directed at Marguerite's judgment, with a written hope, her own words, that when the day finally came, my share of it would be steered by me. Marguerite told me plainly that her own judgment was tired. I'm 63, honey. I've held this 7 years, and I promised her I'd hold it until the condition tripped. It's tripped. She slid the first stack across the table. Drafted. Dated. Ready. A full restructuring that would put everything, the acres, the houses, the succession, the final say, under my direction, with Marguerite staying on only long enough to settle me in. All of it. The orchard my brother had bled into. The main house with my mother's coat still on its peg. The gate. The lane. Every right to point down that road. Take it, my godmother said. Not like temptation. Like logistics, which is exactly what made it so dangerous. You're the only one she'd ever trust it to. And after the week he's given you, the board complaint, the calls to your agency, no one alive would blame you. Then, quieter, a sentence she'd clearly been carrying up from some cellar of her own. Point him to the road, Della. God knows he showed you how. And here is my confession. The one this entire story exists to make. I wanted it. Every cell of me. I sat in that glass room and felt the whip settle into my palm like it had been sized for me from birth. And the fit was perfect. The fit was the entire horror. I saw Thanksgiving with me at the head of the table, deciding who got to eat first. I saw his face at the eviction. It played beautifully in my mind. It always plays beautifully. That's precisely how the ledger finds its next bookkeeper. I looked at my mother's letter, still open at my elbow. Then I asked Marguerite for 1 week, and she studied me a long moment, and something in her expression, I'd almost call it relief, told me she'd been hoping I'd stall exactly like this. He came to me on Wednesday. I want you to picture it because I still do. My father, 67 years old, drove the 2 hours south, the same drive I'd made in penance for 13 years, and stood on the sagging porch of my rented apartment, holding his good hat in both hands. He had never once visited me before. He'd have had to admit, out loud, that I lived somewhere. I didn't invite him in. We stood with the screen door between us, like a confessional grate. "Come home," he said. And I have to be honest about his voice. It wasn't cruel. It was the voice from before, from the rose garden, back when I was small enough to ride on his shoulders. And it knew exactly what it was doing.
"Thanksgiving," he said.
"Your room's still your room. Nobody will say a word about any of it. The county, the paper signing, will put it all down to grief. And moving on. Family holds, Stella." He came within one breath of gracious. And then he finished it because he always finishes it. "All you have to do is tell that woman to renew the lease as it stood. That's all. 1 sentence from you, and you're my daughter again." There it was, priced out plainly. A chair at the table, at market rate. 7 years I had written letters begging a mailbox for exactly this. And now it stood on my porch in its good hat, and all I could see was the invoice stapled to it. I told him I'd give him my answer Friday. He put his hat back on, satisfied, a man who had never once heard my no coming, and got into his truck. My phone was already buzzing in my back pocket.
"Priya."
3 missed calls. Then a text that turned the porch to ice beneath me. "Grandma's at County General. Nosebleed that won't stop.
"Della."
He's been doing her pills, and he doubled them. The drive to that hospital is 2 hours. I know because I made it in under 2. By the time I arrived, they had her stable. And I want to be careful and honest here, because this isn't a story that deals in soap opera comas. A nosebleed that won't quit isn't dramatic television. But on a mismanaged blood thinner, it's a fire alarm. Her blood work came back exactly as wrong as I'd feared. Thinned far past the safe range, the kind of number that makes an ER doctor ask, in a voice you could frost glass with, who's been managing this woman's medications. They gave her vitamin K, kept her for observation, watched for bleeding they couldn't see from the outside. And how it happened was so ordinary it hurts to say out loud. The Consolidated Pharmacy had properly adjusted her dose, per the doctor's orders. My father, laying out her pills each morning on a little saucer like the manager he'd always insisted on being, had kept giving her the old dose, right on top of the new bottle schedule. No chart. No list. No question asked of anyone because asking is for men who don't already know everything. Management is care. The saucer said so. Eleanor was propped up on pillows when they finally let me in, cotton stuffed up one nostril, and she looked at me and rasped, "Tell them I'm not dead yet. Your father will bill me for the flowers." 89 years old, thin as a hymn, still the fastest draw in the county. I laughed so I wouldn't do the other thing. Within days, the county's finding came back, flat and final. Allegations substantiated. Neglect confirmed. A mandated care plan for Eleanor Voss. Professional home care, medication management by licensed hands only, no exceptions, no more saucers. I read it standing in my kitchen and rested my palm flat on the Eleanor folder, the way you'd rest a hand on a dog that had finally found what it was searching for. The lawyer I'd hired called, almost cheerful. The board complaint was aging badly against a substantiated county finding and a stack of my own documentation, filed in the right order. "These things end," he said, in a letter with the word unfounded in it. "Bureaucracy just takes its season." The shield had held. But a care plan needs an address, friends. And every road in this story eventually bent back to the same table. The farmhouse needed repairs. A live-in schedule. Real money. Eleanor's entire estate was a Social Security check and a wedding ring. The trust could fund all of it forever without even noticing. And who the trust would be, come Friday, was either me or the version of me holding the whip. I didn't sleep that Thursday, and I'm not sorry for it. Some nights are simply for arithmetic. I laid 3 things out in a row on my kitchen table. The folder, the letter, the tin box. My whole case, my entire argument, my entire family, reduced to paper. I made myself read my own 7 Octobers back in order. The maples turned early. I'm fine, Grandma. I'm fine. And I finally heard them for exactly what they were. Payments made for 7 straight years into a house I'd already been evicted from. I had never once stopped paying into it. The letters, the guilt, the overfunctioning at work, that quiet private religion of staying useful enough that someday someone would finally owe me a door. My father kept his ledger and his pencil at the head of a table. I had kept mine in stamps. Same book. Same disease. Managed politely. And the stack of papers waiting for my signature in the city, all of it, the acres, the houses, the final say, was that same book again, with one small promotion attached. Head bookkeeper. I thought about my mother, who I had believed, for 7 long years, had died bullied into silence, who had actually spent her final weeks quietly building a fire door with her own signing hand. She hadn't used her land to punish him. She could have at any point in 40 years of marriage. She'd used it exactly once, for exactly one purpose. To make certain that the day he weaponized the family against her daughter again, the weapon would come apart in his own hands. Not a whip.
A door.
There is a difference. And at 4 a.m, at that kitchen table, I finally found the edge of it with both hands. So I did what she would have done. I took a legal pad, and I drew up my own terms. By morning I had 1 page. It was my mother's math, not my father's. And when the sun came up, I drove north to spend it, every line, read aloud, in front of all of them. The conference room holds a long table, 8 chairs, and nothing on the walls but a print of the county courthouse, which is either humility or a threat, depending on your afternoon. By 10 o'clock, we were all assembled. Marguerite at the head, her attorney beside her, my lawyer at my elbow, Priya in the waiting room, holding coffee she wasn't drinking, my father across from me in his church jacket, my brother beside him, gray around the mouth, a man 90 days out from an auction. Nobody had told them which stack of paper actually existed. My father was courteous. That's what I remember most, how courteous he was. He was certain, on his knee, that one of 2 things was about to happen. Either I'd taken his porch offer, and the lease would quietly renew, or I'd taken the whip, in which case he was fully prepared to be wronged magnificently in front of witnesses. You could see the speech folded neatly in his breast pocket. Either outcome fit inside his world. In the first, the family holds. In the second, I was him all along, and the code survives even in exile. What that room, that county, that entire bloodline had no slot for, was a third thing. Marguerite opened the folder, and I saw the 2 signature blocks my lawyer had described, the entire future of 280 acres, cocked and ready like a hammer. She looked at me, no push in it at all, and I will thank her for that until the day I die.
Della.
The trust is prepared to proceed at your direction. How do you direct it? I took out my 1 page. My father settled back, arms crossing, already braced for the whip he understood. I unfolded it, smoothed the crease flat, and I read the first line to the room. I decline. I decline any appointment, ownership, or control of the Voss family trust, now and permanently. The room made no sound at all, which in my family is the sound of shock. Nathaniel's head lifted. Marguerite's attorney glanced up over his glasses. My father blinked once, slow, the blink of a man whose script has just gone missing from his own pocket. I kept reading before anyone found their footing, because I'd built that page in the order a nurse builds a shift. Most urgent first. The trust would establish, from my directed share, an endowment with exactly 1 job. The 12 roadside acres and the old packing barn, the 1 building on that farm that had ever truly belonged to everybody, would be converted and licensed as an adult day center and home care hub for the elderly of the county. Transportation for the ones who couldn't drive anymore. Nursing visits for the ones nobody checked on. $150,000 in seed funding, in partnership with the county agency I'd already spoken to twice. Its name, in block letters on the page, the Colleen Voss House. I heard Marguerite's breath change, from across the table. The only thing that woman surrendered all day. Second, the Blue Farmhouse. Deed rights of occupancy to Eleanor Voss, for life. Repairs funded, a full care plan paid in complete by the trust, professional aides, medication management, the county's compliance boxes checked twice over. Priya to be hired as care coordinator, salaried, because the person who'd sent up the flare deserved to run the lighthouse. And me, at that farmhouse every Tuesday, as her granddaughter, and as her nurse, on a schedule in a chart no shirt pocket could ever misplace again. My father found his voice around then, and it came out scraped. This is her land. Our family's land. You're giving it to strangers. Old strangers. I looked at him for the first time since the porch, and I gave him the only line on that page I hadn't written for the lawyers. You held this family, Dad. You held it, and held it. Held things break. Tended things grow. Mom knew the difference. It's why you're a tenant. 3 signatures remained on that table, and each one cost more than the last. The first spent mercy on my brother, read aloud, so Nathaniel heard every term arrive straight from my mouth. The trust would offer Whitfield Orchards a new lease at fair market rate, phased in across 3 seasons, long enough to restructure the debt properly with the bank instead of feeding it to an auction. The operations books, open to the trust annually. And the lease would run to the operation itself, Nathaniel and his wife's names, with succession to their children, if they wanted dirt that would finally, for once, deal with them honestly. A fair chance, priced fairly, which is all my brother had ever actually been denied. He stared down the length of that table, and his jaw worked, and what he finally got out wasn't thank you. It was better. Why? Because you stayed and I left, and it bought us the exact same nothing. One of us should get to buy something different. The second signature governed my father. Life tenancy in the main house, his home for 40 years, no one pointing him toward any road for as long as he wanted it. And attached to it, flat as a fence line, no role in Eleanor's care, medical or financial or otherwise. No authority at the Colleen Voss house. Not 1 acre. Not 1 say. Ever again. A roof, without a kingdom. He didn't sign anything just then. His signature wasn't required for any of it, and watching him understand that, truly understand it, was the closest I came, all day, to looking away. The third signature was mine. A waiver, drafted at my own instruction, renouncing forever any personal claim, present or future, against the trust or its land. The main house I grew up in. My mother's kitchen. Her roses by the door. Whatever girl still lived inside me, waiting to be summoned home. I signed her away. I understood the finality. I told my lawyer, when he asked me formally. And I bought my way entirely out of their ledger, with the only currency I had left in my column. I dated it October again.
Capped the pen. It was done.
He caught me on the steps outside alone. Hat in his hands again. And for the first time in my entire life, my father looked to me like what he also was, an old man on a courthouse square in a county that had been discussing him at breakfast for 2 weeks. You think I'm a monster, he said. Not sorry. And I want that noted. To his very last syllable. Not sorry. But then he looked past me, at nothing, at the middle distance where his kind keep everything, and he told me the only story from his own childhood I have ever heard him tell. His father and his uncle had split their land badly, in a bad year, and there had been words, and his father had never spoken his own brother's name again. Had made the whole family unspeak it, at birthdays, at funerals both. My father had been 9 years old. He'd learned to drive a tractor while his own father watched a fence line like it belonged to a rival country. Dad's set of family holds because one hand. He stopped mid-sentence. His own lifelong proverb came apart in his mouth right in front of me, and I watched fear look out through a face where I had only ever been shown granite. It didn't excuse a single October of it. Both things get to be true. That's the hardest sentence in this whole story. Behind us, the door opened. Marguerite came down the steps, and held out a second cream envelope, twin to mine, his name on it in a dead woman's hand. She asked me to wait, Marguerite said, level to the end, for the day you had nothing left. My father looked at that envelope for a long, long moment. Then he took it, slid it into his coat pocket unopened, and said, "Tell your grandmother the groceries stop Monday," and walked to his truck through the thin October sun. He never read it, as far as I know, to this day. He built himself one final room and refuses to enter it. My mother's voice waits inside it still. I drove south with the window cracked, cold air rinsing the courthouse off my skin. And somewhere past the county line, I finally understood what had actually changed hands in that room. It wasn't acreage. For 7 years I'd been waiting, underneath the work, underneath the letters, underneath all that competence, for someone up north to revise my file, to reopen my case, to decide I'd finally been useful enough, good enough, nurse enough, to be reinstated as a daughter. That waiting was the very last thing my father still held of mine. And he'd been holding it without even knowing, the same way he'd held Eleanor's letters in a shirt pocket. It ended right there on those steps. I watched an old man choose an unopened envelope over his own wife's final words. And something in me quietly closed its account. Not in anger. Anger is only the ledger, flipped upside down. It closed the way a shift ends. Charted. Handed off.
Done.
At a gas station on the way home, I took the 7th letter out of my glove compartment, the one I'd written back when I was still paying rent on all of it, and I read it. It sounded like a stranger's letter. Light and careful, asking between every single line, "Please find me worth answering." I dropped it in the trash barrel by the pumps. Then I bought a postcard off the wire rack, a terrible one, a cartoon groundhog in a nurse's cap, and I wrote my grandmother the first mail in 7 years that wasn't asking anybody for anything at all. "See you Tuesday. Love, Della." The rest I can tell you quickly because the rest is the part that finally behaves. Winter went to the contractors. The old packing barn got insulation, a ramp, wide doors, a kitchen that could turn out soup for 30, and a long south wall of windows facing the orchard rows, because if you're going to sit somewhere at 85, you should be able to watch something still growing. The county agency signed on by February. Eleanor's old doctor agreed to consult. 2 retired aides from my old agency came back out of retirement the same day Priya called them. Eleanor was home by Thanksgiving. New furnace. New porch boards. Aides morning and evening. Her blood checked on a schedule taped inside a cabinet door, where anyone at all could read it. Nothing hidden in that house anymore. Not even the medicine. I was there every Tuesday, on the chart, exactly as promised. We answered 7 years of letters out loud, one at a time, her reading hers, me reciting mine from memory, both of us editing shamelessly as we went. In March, on a wet gray morning, Priya stood on a ladder over the barn's new door and screwed a sign into the beam, while Eleanor supervised from the car with the heater running. The Colleen Voss house. White paint on old barnwood. My mother's full name, facing the county road, where every single car that passes has to read it. We opened in April with 12 members, which the county coordinator called a strong start, and Eleanor called a decent crop. They came by van and by grandson's trucks. A retired schoolteacher who hadn't eaten a meal with another person in 4 years. 2 widowed farmers who discovered they'd hated each other's fathers and became inseparable by May. Euchre on Tuesdays. Blood pressure checks by the windows. A vegetable bed out front, planted exactly wheelchair height. Eleanor installed herself at the head table and announced she was quality control. Nobody has ever once voted her out. And my father, he's still there in the main house, under his caretaker's rent. He runs nothing now. Nathaniel runs the orchard, and the books go to the trust every autumn, audited and open, and the operation is slowly climbing back out of its hole. One honest season at a time. Slower than a miracle. Sturdier than one. He keeps his fences and his opinions. At harvest, you can see him across the road from our windows, still supervising the pickers from the tailgate, straight-backed, still the tallest thing standing in the row. He has never once set foot inside the Colleen Voss house. He tells his own version at the diner, I'm told. The daughter, who brought in lawyers. the wife who went behind his back, the county that meddled where it wasn't wanted, and some of them still nod along. I've made a full and final peace with that. The cream envelope, Priya tells me, still lives in the inside pocket of his good coat. He wears that coat to church. He buried his wife's last words next to his own heart and will not read them. And if you want to know what a ledger finally cost the man holding the pencil, that's it, right there. A letter he'll carry to his grave, rather than ever owe it a reply. This past October was cold and gray again, 1 year almost to the week since a finger first pointed me down that road. I spent the anniversary on my knees in the dirt by the center's entrance, setting in rose cuttings. Her roses, the ones I'd grown for years by my own porch steps, from the cutting she pressed into my hand a lifetime of Sundays ago. Plant it where you are. I finally heard that sentence correctly, Mom. Priya came out to help. Eleanor watched from the window, tapping the glass to correct our spacing. Wrong about none of it, as usual. The driveway they line has no gate. It never will. I wrote that into the site plan myself, and my lawyer, God love him, made the contractor initial it. Anyone can turn in. Anyone can be brought. The porch light stays lit until 7 every evening for the vans and the grandson's trucks. And when I lock up at night and look back from the road, the whole barn sits there glowing in the dark, like a kitchen where nobody ever gets sent away from the table. My mother built a door. I only ever needed to stop knocking on the wrong one. Leaving that family was never my sin. It was the first thing I ever did that my mother, rest her, would have called an inheritance. And it's the one thing of hers I'd pass on to anyone still standing at a gate, still hoping it will finally open.
Some doors you stop knocking on. Some you build instead.
A finger pointing at a cold gray road. A silver car easing up the lane. A single word that took 7 years to build. And a barn full of strangers, with nowhere else to be, eating soup under my mother's name. If you've ever had to walk away from a table just to keep your own dignity, this channel is your porch light. By the way, where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments, because it's amazing to see how far these stories travel around the world. I'm Della. Thank you for staying until the end of the drive.